G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. And tonight we will be looking at continuing in the book of Amos. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. We'll be starting off tonight in chapter 1, verse 6, and we're going to get down to chapter 5, verse 17. Last session, we finished off with Joel, and with Joel, we saw the judgment of the Gentiles. And that was at the time of the final restoration and regathering of Israel. And that was after the second coming of the Messiah. We see that there is a place called the Valley of Jehoshaphat. And the basis of judgment was pro or anti-Semitism. Antichrist called for a war against the Jews. He sanctified a war. So it was a holy war against the Jews. And we saw that there was great enthusiasm shown amongst the Gentiles. Even the weak were deceived into believing that they were strong, and they turned their farming implements into weapons of war. The Bible also tells us that they gathered with speed and haste because they just could not wait to take part in this massacre of the Jewish people. But we will see that they will gather together not for successful war against the Jews, but they're going to be gathering together for judgment in the Valley of Jehoshaphat. And there we will see the sheep Gentiles, the pro-Semites, or the goat Gentiles, the anti-Semites, facing Messiah. Multitudes in the Valley of Decision. For the day of Jehovah is near in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, the Valley of Decision. So what we're going to see from what we saw from Joel was that all the surviving Gentiles who come through the tribulation period will gather into this valley. And the result of this judgment, the kingdom will be established, and Israel will know that Jehovah is their God. All the land will be well watered. All the brooks of Israel will will be filled with water. It will be just a marvelous place to be in, according to the prophets. And there will be a special millennial river we see, which flowing from the temple. Also, we know from Joel that Egypt will be a desolation for 40 years, for the first 40 years. And also Edom will be a desolation for 1,000 years. The reason for the desolation of Egypt and Edom, because of the violence done to the children of Judah, the children of Israel. That brought us to the end of the book of Joel, and we started the book of Amos. He was a prophet who prophesied on King Uzziah and Jeroboam II. And at that time, it was a time of outward prosperity, but inwardly, it was a time, especially for Israel, the northern kingdom, of heavy idolatry. Amos, he was from the southern kingdom, Judah. Remember that after the death of Solomon, the kingdom of Israel split into two, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom. Southern kingdom was Judah, northern kingdom was Israel. Okay. The theme of Amos's book is the judgment of Israel, the northern kingdom, and God's judgment against the nations, the Gentiles, starts off with distant nations to then bringing it nearer to blood relatives. It starts off, we did last session, with Damascus or Syria. And why were they judged? They were judged because they turned over Jewish prisoners and they cut them in pieces with their farming implements. So we see with Damascus, the judgment against Damascus will be the destruction of the nation. And where we are today is we are now looking into God's judgment against the nations from chapter 1, verse 3 to chapter 2, verse 16. And now we go to Gaza or Philistia. And we see this in verses 6 to 8 of chapter 1. Thus says Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they carried away captive the whole people, to deliver them up to Edom. But I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, and it shall devour the palaces thereof. And I will cut off the inhabitants from Ashdod, and him that holdeth the scepter from Ashkelon. And I'll turn my hand against Ekron, and the remnant of the Philistines shall perish. Thus says the Lord Jehovah. So we're going to see for all of these, he begins with the cause of the judgment, and then he gives a judgment for the cause. The cause of judgment in verse 6 is that they sold Jewish slaves to Edom. We saw this right back in Obadiah 11. And as we already saw back in Obadiah, Edom was considered by the prophets as Israel's and Judah's worst enemy. So because they sold Jews as slaves to Edom, in verses 7 to 8 comes a judgment. It says the city of Gaza in verse 7 is destined for destruction. In verse 8, Amos mentions three other Philistine cities, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron. For Ashdod, the inhabitants will suffer. For Ashkelon, the king will suffer. For Ekron, the city will suffer until the remnant of the Philistines is destroyed. Now, remember that Philistia, which was the land of the Philistines, was comprised of 5 cities, of which we only see 4 of them mentioned here: Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Ekron. The one missing here is the city of Gath, and the reason that it's missing is that by this time Gath had already been destroyed by King Uzziah in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 6. So one of the Philistine cities is already gone. The other 4 are going to suffer destruction in accordance with this prophecy. The Philistines, too, were perennial enemies of Israel, and here again, as Israel hears the prophecy of Amos, they can egg him on even further. Keep on preaching, they're saying. Remember, from last session, we saw that Amos is prophesying from the distant nations, and he gradually gets closer and closer to Israel. So at this moment, Philistines are a long way away from Israel, and keep on preaching, Amos. Then he moves from Gaza, he moves now to Tyre or Phoenicia in verses 9 to 10. Thus says Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Tyre, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they delivered up the whole people to Edom and remembered not the brotherly covenant. But I will send a fire in the wall of Tyre, and it shall devour the palaces thereof. So what we see here in verse 9 is that the cause of the judgment is very similar to the previous one in Philistia. They delivered up Jewish slaves to Edom. But for them, it's a worse crime than what the Philistines did, because for them, it was a failure to remember the brotherly covenant. Now, what we see here is that there was a covenant between the Jewish nations and Phoenicia or Tyre. David had made a covenant with them back in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 11. And Solomon also made a covenant with Phoenicia in 1 Kings 5, 1 to 18. Now, while David fought wars against all the surrounding nations, there was no war that he declared upon Phoenicia. And no king of Israel, or king of Judah for that matter, ever made war against Phoenicia. And yet, Phoenicia now forgot her brotherly covenant, as seen in her willingness to sell Jewish slaves to Israel's worst enemy, Edom. Now, their destruction was fulfilled by Alexander the Great, and something we'll catch up on when we get down to Zechariah, which is quite a way away. Now, so Amos then begins moving towards 3 other nations which were now blood related to Israel. They were distantly blood related, but they are still nevertheless blood related. And we're going to see the first one here is Edom. Edom we see in verses 11 to 12 of chapter 1. Thus says Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Edom, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he did pursue his brother with the sword, and did cast off all pity, and his anger did tear perpetually and he kept his wrath forever. But I will send a fire upon Teman, and it shall devour the palaces of Bozrah. So in verse 11, we see the cause, and here the cause for judgment against Edom is for killing Jews. And as the other prophets do, Amos also points out in verse 11 that Edom has had this perpetual hatred against the Jews. And his anger did tear perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. And that's why the prophets are so hard on Edom. They're harder they're harder than on the other countries, and that is why, while other countries will survive into the millennium, Edom will not. So because they killed Jews and because they had a long history of perpetual hatred against the Jews, the judgment comes in verse 12, and two of her key cities are destined for destruction, and that is Teman and Bozrah. Now we're moving closer. We are moving up to Ammon. Now Ammon is also a blood relative. And we see in verses 13 to 15 of chapter 1. Thus says Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of the children of Ammon, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. Because they have ripped up the women with child of Gilead, that they may enlarge their border. But I will kindle a fire in the wall of Rabbah, and it shall devour the palaces thereof, with shouting in the day of battle, with a tempest in the day of the whirlwind. And their king shall go into captivity, he and his princes together, saith Jehovah. So for Ammon, what we see here is the cause in verse 13. It was because they ripped up pregnant women. And what was the motivation for doing this? They attempted to enlarge their own borders by destroying the seed line of the Jews. They're trying to wipe out the Jewish nation. And by ripping up pregnant women, they're reducing the population of the others. And in this way, they're going to be able to extend their borders. So in verses 14 and 15 comes a judgment. In verse 14, their capital city, Rabbah, which is the same as the city of Amman today in Jordan, it's destined to be destroyed by war. And in verse 15, the royal household of Ammon will go into captivity. Just for your info, remember, Esau is a blood relative because Esau is a brother of Jacob, the father of the Jewish people. Moab and Ammon, they were sons of an incestuous relationship between Lot, the nephew of Abraham, and his daughters. So that's where the bloodline comes in. Now with Moab, we see in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, another blood relative here. Thus saith Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Moab, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because he burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime. But I'll send the fire upon Moab, and it shall devour the palaces of Kerioth. And Moab shall die with tumult, with shouting, and with the sound of the trumpet. And I'll cut off the judge from the midst thereof, and will slay all the princes thereof with him, saith Jehovah. So here we see the cause of the judgment is that they burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime. What was the problem with this? Well, this showed disrespect for someone already dead. And we see in 2 Kings 3, 26 to 27, 2 Kings 3, 26 to 27, while that passage is not actually dealing with the same incident, it does show a special antagonism of the Moabites against the king of Edom. And this was one of the ways that they showed it by showing disrespect for an already dead king. So the judgment now comes in verses 2 to 3. And that's that the key city of Kerioth will be destroyed along with the countryside. But also the ruling house, we see in verse 3, will suffer the judgment of death, and the princes will all be slain. Now, as the audience of Israel heard the judgments against Syria, Philistia and Phoenicia, they probably were shouting for joy because they were distant. But now against Edom, Ammon, and Moab, they're probably happy as well. They're maybe not quite as joyous. But now Amos moves to a nation that is very closely related by blood, and that nation is Judah. Remember, Amos's prophecy is, he prophesies against the northern kingdom, but here he's just prophesying some judgment against these nations. And here we come to Judah. So at this point, Israel might be getting a little bit toey because, they're next in line. In Judah, we see this in chapter 2, verses 4 to 5. Thus says Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Judah, yes, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have rejected the law of Jehovah and have not kept his statutes. And their lies have caused them to err, after which their fathers did walk. But I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem. So for Judah, the cause of her coming judgment, or their coming judgment, is for rejecting the law of Moses. It was disobedience to the Mosaic law. And then what we see here is they failed to keep the statutes. They are characterized by falsehood and lying, which actively shows their disobedience to the law. And the present generation of Judah is guilty of repeating the errors of the previous generations of Judah. So the judgment here is in verse 5. And Amos predicts the coming fall of Jerusalem when the palaces of Jerusalem will be destroyed by fire. And this was eventually fulfilled by the Babylonians in 586 BC. Now, having spent just 2 verses on Judah, and no doubt Israel was getting a bit nervous now because they knew Amos was actually from Judah and he's prophesying against his own nation. If he's going to say such severe words against his own country, what's he going to say about the host country, Israel? The remaining part of the chapter now deals with his main subject throughout his prophecy, which is the northern kingdom of Israel in verses 6 to 16. And also, just by the by, northern kingdom was those 10 tribes which stayed north. Down south, we had Judah and we had Benjamin. Now we see Israel, we see this in chapter 2, verses 6 to 16, and we see the cause of judgment in verses 6 to 12. Thus says Jehovah, for 3 transgressions of Israel, yea, for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have sold the righteous for silver and the needy for a pair of shoes. They that pant after the dust of the earth and the head of the poor, and turn aside the way of the meek, and the man and his father go unto the same maiden to profane my holy name. And they lay themselves down beside every altar upon clothes taken in pledge. And in the house of their God they drink the wine of such as have been fined. So as far as the cause of their judgment is concerned, Israel is going to be judged for 4 reasons. The first one we see in verses 6 to the first part of verse 7, and that is for oppressing the poor. He points out here that the judges allow themselves to be bribed in order to enslave the poor in violation of Deuteronomy 16:19. The poor had a very special place in the Mosaic law. He also states that they pant after the dust of the earth on the head of the poor. What's he talking about here? What he's talking about here is this. This means that the poor, they so oppressed the poor that the poor people had put dust on their heads as a sign of mourning because they were so oppressed. They were so oppressed that they actually put dust on their heads to demonstrate their mourning. And then in the second part of verse 7, we see the other reason that there were now judgment against them. It's for their immorality. the father and son have intercourse with the same girl. And this is in violation of Leviticus chapter 18, verse 7 and chapter 18, verse 15. She was probably a temple prostitute because it says that they lay down before all kinds of altars in verse 8. Now, such a sin was punishable by death, according to Leviticus 20, verse 11. But now it is practiced in Israel with impunity. And the last phrase in verse 7 says, to profane my holy name. The Hebrew word leman, the English translation there, it simply means to, where it says to profane, but it means more than that in the Hebrew. It means being in favor of something or being for something. The point of using this word here is that they do these things, like a father and son sleeping with a prostitute, the same woman. They do these things for the specific purpose, and it's a deliberate attempt to profane God's name. They just don't do it. This and happen to profane God's name by accident. Father and son actually go to the same cult prostitute for the same specific purpose of actively trying to profane God's name. It had got that bad in Israel that they were going out of their way to do this. And then the third thing we see is in verse 8, it was their wild drinking and drunken parties. He says they laid down on upper garments taken in pledge. Now, in those days, when a poor man needed to borrow some money, what he would do would be he would give his upper garments, his outer coat, for a pledge, which means that he will return the money, but according to Mosaic law, that garment will have to be returned to the poor man before sundown. And we see that in Exodus 22, 26 to 27. Why? Even though it was a pledge? Well, because it was the only way of a poor man to keep warm. So it had to be returned to him for the night. And then the next morning, he'd give it back to the one who'd loaned him the money. Furthermore, we see also in the Mosaic law, it says that the one who takes the upper garment in pledge must not be the one to sleep on it, which is exactly what they've done here. Now we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 12 to 13. Now what we see these men doing here is that they take the garments that they've taken in pledge, they don't return them by sundown, and they actually sleep upon them, and they use it for their parties, and they drink wine at these parties, which was also bought with unjust fines. It's not their own money that they're spending, but it is the money that they took in unjust fines from those that there had been oppressing. And then we see in verses 9 to 12, he now gives a more elaborate reason they rebelled against God's blessings. They rebelled against God's blessings, Israel did. In verse 9, this is God telling them now what I did for you guys. He said, yet destroyed I the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks, yet I destroyed his fruit from above and his roots from beneath. Also I brought you up out of the land of Egypt and led you 40 years in the wilderness, to possess the land of the Amorite. And I raised up of your sons for prophets and of your young men for Nazarites. Is it not even thus, O ye children of Israel, says Jehovah? But you gave the Nazarites wine to drink and commanded the prophets, saying, prophesy not. So the reason that they're going to be judged is for rebelling against God's blessings. And he reminds them of some of these blessings. In verse 9, he destroyed the Amorites out of the land, out of the promised land. Remember the Amorites, it says their sin had just filled up so much that God says, right, take them out. Secondly, he brought them out of Egypt. And in verse 10, he provided for them in the wilderness, in their wanderings. And then he gave them the land in verse 10. And in verse 11, he gave them spiritual leadership. And this would have been through the prophets and through the Nazarites. And at that point, the end of verse 11, he asked them a rhetorical question. Is it not so, O Israel? The answer is obviously, yes, it is. You're absolutely right. It is so. Yet in verse 12, Israel's response to all the blessings of God that he poured out upon them was the Nazarites who had taken a Nazarite vow in which they could not drink wine. These men gave them wine to drink. And the prophets who were sent to prophesy were told not to prophesy. In fact, Amos is going to be told later on not to prophesy in Israel. In other words, they tried to countermand the whole purpose of being a prophet or the whole purpose of being a Nazarite. They were thwarting those purposes. Israel here revealed her own lack of commitment to God and her unwillingness to hear his word. And then we see the judgment in verses 13 to 16 of chapter 2. So with these four reasons, judgment comes. Behold, I will press you in your place as a cart presses that is full of sheaves. And flight shall perish from the swift, and the strong shall not strengthen his force, neither shall the mighty deliver himself. Neither shall he stand that handleth the bow, and he that is swift of foot shall not deliver himself. Neither shall he that rideth the horse deliver himself. And he that is courageous among the mighty shall flee away naked in that day, says Jehovah. So when the judgment comes in verse 13, God is going to pressure Israel. Israel will be pressured by God until the back is broken. And in verses 14 to 16, he gives three results of that pressing by God. Verse 14 will be the scourge of war. They'll fail. They'll lose their strength. Verse 15, the failure of all weapons to defend Israel. Verse 16, the failure of all courage to stand before the enemy. Now, this is the first section of Amos's book, which is the introductory section. And he spends most of the rest of his book on Israel, but he worked his way towards it and then showed at the end of his first prophetic discourse who his subject is going to be and what the tenor of his message will be. So we're now into the second section of Amos. This is the prophetic proclamation of the sins and the judgment of Israel, which we're going to find in chapter 3, verse 1 to chapter 6, verse 14. Altogether, we're going to have five proclamations. The first three we're going to see will begin with the words, hear ye this word. And we see that in chapter 3, verse 1, chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 5, verse 1. And so we'll call these the first, second, and third, hear ye judgments. Hear ye judgments. And the last two judgments are a reference to woe judgments, chapters 5, verse 18, woe to you, and chapter 6, verse 1, woe to them. So now he's going to follow here the same pattern that he did in chapters 1 and 2. So Amos is going to spell out the cause or reason for the coming judgment, and then he's going to spell out the judgment for us. First, hear ye judgment, we see in chapter 3, verse 1 to 15. And the cause of it is in chapter 3, verse 1 to 10. Altogether, we're going to see here that there are three specific causes. And the first one is in verses 1 to 2, is because of Israel's unique relationship to God. Hear this word that Jehovah has spoken against you, O children of Israel, against the whole family which I brought up out of the land of Egypt, saying, you only have I known of all the families of the earth. Therefore I will visit upon you all your iniquities. So one reason that God is going to be especially severe against Israel is because of Israel's unique relationship to God. In verse 1, this is the nation that God brought out of Egypt. And in the first part of verse 2, he points out, you only have I known of all the families. Now, God knew about other nations. It's not that's pretty obvious from chapters 1 and 2 because he knew what they're like. But of the two Hebrew words for knowing, this one here means to know by experience, to know by intimate experience. Only with the Jewish nation did he enter into a covenant relationship and he set them apart. It's only with this nation did he enter in and know by experience or enter into a covenantal relationship. And this was the whole nation which he brought out of Egypt and now which is divided into two. The covenant that he made with them still stands. And that's why he says this is so severe. So because of Israel's unique relationship to God, he says at the end of verse 2, therefore, because of this intimate relationship, therefore, I will visit upon you all your iniquities. So ask yourself, why do Jews suffer more? Because of that special relationship. And God will make sure that Jewish sins are punished more than other sins. In fact, Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 to 2, Isaiah spells out there that Israel receives double for all her sins. So as much as God punishes Gentiles for their sins, he punishes Israel double because of this unique relationship, because there's a principle here: to whom much is given, much is required. And as he shows here, Israel has received much more than any other nation. And then secondly, in verses 3 to 8, he deals with the cause and the effect. In verses 3 to 6, his point is that effects have causes and causes have effects. And he then lists these various illustrations of the cause and effect relationship. In verse 3, he says, shall two walk together except they have agreed? Will a lion roar in the forest when he has no prey? Will a young lion cry out of his den if he have taken nothing? Can a bird fall in a snare upon the earth where no gin is set for him? Shall a snare spring up from the ground and have taken nothing at all? Shall the trumpet be blown in a city and the people not be afraid? Shall evil befall a city and Jehovah hath not done it? So in verse 3, we see people. Verse 4, we see animals. Verse 5, we see birds. Verse 6, we see cities. In verse 7, surely the Lord Jehovah will do nothing except he reveal his secret unto his servants the prophets. The lion hath roared, who will not fear? The Lord Jehovah has spoken, who can but prophesy? So after giving these examples of the cause and the effect relationship in verses 3 to 6, he applies it in verses 7 to 8 to the role of the prophet. His point here is that whatever happens to Israel are effects, and effects have causes, but both the effect and the cause will be revealed through the prophets. And then he points out here that prophetic utterances themselves are actually effects. And the cause is the fact that God has spoken. So God speaks, and the effect of God speaking is that the prophet prophesies. So that when God has spoken through the prophet, the prophet cannot help but prophesy. And Amos, defending his prophetic office here, he points out that what he is saying is an effect. And the cause of his prophesying is that God has spoken. And here, what God has spoken is an effect, and the cause is Israel's sin. As far as what happens to Israel, God will do nothing except to reveal it to the prophets. Now, this is not true for other nations, but it is very true of the Jewish nations. So because of this cause and effect relationship, there is a second reason why judgment must come. because the judgment is an effect and their sin is the cause. Because they're sinning, judgment must come. And then finally, we see in verses 9 to 10, he calls to witness. He issues a call to witness. Publish ye in the palaces of Ashdod and in the palaces in the land of Egypt, and say, assemble yourselves upon the mountains of Samaria, and behold what great tumults are therein, and what oppressions in the midst thereof. For they know not to do right, says Jehovah, who store up violence and robbery in their palaces. So what we see here is that in verse 9, God now calls upon Gentile nations to witness the sins of Israel. And these are Gentile nations who are guilty of their own sins, are now called upon to witness the sins of Israel. And he calls upon Ashdod of the Philistines and Egypt. He even calls upon the mountains that surround Samaria. The mountains surrounding Samaria are higher than the hill upon which Samaria was built. And so if you stand on any of the surrounding mountains, you'll be looking down upon the city of Samaria and see what's going on. And so he's calling them to stand on the mountains of Samaria and then view the sins of Israel. And then we see in verse 10, he describes some of the sins of Samaria that they can be witness to, and that includes violence and robbery. So for these reasons, in verses 1 to 10 comes the judgment of verses 11 to 15. And every judgment begins with the word therefore. Therefore, we see in verse 11, and a good rule for interpreting scripture is always, when you see this word therefore, you're going to ask yourself, what is it there for? Here it is one of these logical connective things because of what happens in verses 1 to 10. Comes the judgment of verses 11 to 15. Let's Now we have the judgment in chapter 3, verse 11 to 15. Therefore, thus says the Lord Jehovah, an adversary there shall be, even round about the land, and he shall bring down thy strength from thee, and thy palaces shall be plundered. Thus says Jehovah, as a shepherd rescueth out of the mouth of the lion 2 legs or a piece of an ear, so shall the children of Israel be rescued that sit in Samaria in the corner of a couch, and on the silken cushion of a bed. Now, concerning this judgment, he points out several things here. First of all, in verse 11, the city of Samaria, the capital, is to be destroyed. And secondly, in verse 12, only a remnant will escape. And he says here, just as a shepherd, when he sees a lion attack one of his sheep and he doesn't get there in time, all he can rescue is a leg or an ear. That's the way it's going to be with Israel. Most of Israel will be destroyed, but only the leg or the ear of Israel will survive. Only a small remnant will survive. And then in verse 13, hear ye and testify against the house of Jacob, said the Lord, Jehovah, the God of hosts. For in the day that I shall visit the transgression of Israel upon him, I will also visit the altars of Bethel, and the horns of the altar shall be cut off and fall to the ground. And I will smite the winter house with the summer house, and the houses of ivory shall perish, and the great houses shall have an end, says Jehovah. So in verses 13 to 14 here, what we see is that the key idolatrous city of Bethel is going to be destroyed. And that more than the city of Dan. Remember, in the northern kingdom, Bethel and Dan were the 2 idolatrous centers. So not only did they have the worship of the golden calf, this is Bethel, this is why it will be destroyed. They also had the worship of Baal. In verse 15, we see that their wealth will also be destroyed. The capital of Israel, the northern kingdom, was Samaria. And we had a King Ahab who was there, and he actually built an ivory palace. In fact, archaeologists have found that palace, and they also found a great deal of ivory. So having an ivory palace showed the wealth of Samaria, but now all that wealth is to be destroyed. And the fulfillment of this, these verses 11 to 15, you can find it in 2 Kings 17, 5 to 6. Now we have the second hear ye judgment in chapter 4, 1 to 11, of chapter 4, 1 to 13. The cause is in chapter 4, 1 to 11. And we have three causes of the judgment here. And the first problem in verses 1 to 3 is oppressing the poor. Hear this word, ye kine of Bashan, that are in the mountains of Samaria, that oppress the poor, that crush the needy, that say unto their lords, bring and let us drink. The Lord Jehovah has sworn by his holiness that, lo, the day shall come upon you that they shall take you away with hooks, and your residue with fish hooks. And you shall go out of the breaches, every one straight before her. You shall cast yourselves into Harmon, says Jehovah. So the first problem in verses 1 to 3 is the oppressing of the poor. And what we see here is the instigators in verse 1 are the luxuriously living women. He calls them by a very uncomplimentary name. He says, you cows, or kine, K-I-N-E, of Bashan. Who are these? These are the wealthy women of Samaria who oppress the poor in order to be able to live in such luxury. And the lords of verse 1 are their husbands, and they are the ones who instigate their husbands to carry out the oppression against the poor, to take away what the poor, whatever they have left. And so that these cows can live in luxury. So he announces in verses 2 to 3 their coming captivity. They're going to be forced into captivity. And this is a necessary judgment because of God's holiness. He cannot tolerate such sin. And the second cause for judgment we see in verses 4 to 5 is because of their adherence to idolatry. Come, verse 4, come to Bethel and transgress, to Gilgal and multiply transgression, and bring your sacrifices every morning, and your tithes every 3 days, and offer a sacrifice of thanksgiving of that which is leavened, and proclaim freewill offerings and publish them. For this pleaseth you, O you children of Israel, saith the Lord Jehovah. So what we see in verses 4 to 5 is their second sin is a constant adherence to idolatry, and he names two idolatrous centers. He names Bethel again, and he also names Gilgal, which is a few miles north of Bethel. And also in verses 4 to 5, he spells out their deeds. And the point here is that they do offer up proper sacrifices. These are proper sacrifices under the law, but these sacrifices are put to an improper use because they're being offered to idols. These are proper sacrifices under the Mosaic law being offered up to the idols. And it shows them to be outwardly, they're very religious, but it's attached to a false religion. So idolatry is a second reason for the coming judgment. Then in verses 6 to 11, the third one is because of the ineffectiveness of the previous divine judgments and chastisements. And I also have given you cleanness of teeth in all your cities, and want of bread in all your places. Yet have ye not returned unto me, says Jehovah. And I also have withholden the rain from you, when there were yet 3 months to the harvest. And I cause it to rain upon one city, and cause it not to rain upon another city. One piece was rained upon, and the piece whereupon it rained not withered. So 2 or 3 cities wandered unto one city to drink water, and were not satisfied. Yet have you not returned unto me, says Jehovah. Verse 9, I have smitten you with blasting and mildew. The multitude of your gardens and your vineyards and your fig trees and your olive trees hath the palmer worm destroyed. Yet have ye not returned unto me, says Jehovah. In verse 10, he says, Yet I have sent among you the pestilence after the manner of Egypt. Your young men have I slain with the sword, and have carried away your horses, and I have made the stench of your camp to come up even into your nostrils. Yet have you not returned unto me, says Jehovah. I have overthrown cities among you, as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, and you were as a brand plucked out of the burning, yet have you not returned unto me, says Jehovah. So the point of these verses 6 to 11 is that the previous divine chastisements have not been effective to get Israel to return. And he lists one judgment after another. Yet he concludes here, yet you have not returned unto me, says Jehovah. And in verse 6, he sent famine upon them. It says that they had clean white teeth. Why? Because there was no food to dirty their teeth. And that's what he's saying here. In verse 7 to 8, God sent a drought against them, 3 whole months of it before the harvest was due. This was the time that they needed the rain the most, and that is when the lack of rain is the most devastating. Also, we see here that the drought God sent was selective. It rained over here, but not over there. And for this very reason, this phenomenon was actually observable. They could see it. It should have demonstrated to Israel that God was indeed in control here. But that didn't work either. So as well as drought in verse 9, God sent them locusts and mildew. And we had that chamsin, the winds, yet still they failed to return. And fourth, in verse 10, he sent them war and they failed to return. They'd suffered a massive desolation in verse 11, similar to Sodom and Gomorrah, except here that some of them were as a brand plucked out of the burning fire. So he did rescue some, and yet they failed to return to him. And in spite of all these previous chastisements that God had sent upon them, they still failed to respond. And this is the third reason why the judgment has to fall again upon them. So beginning again with the word therefore, in verses 12 to 13 comes a judgment. Therefore, thus will I do unto you, O Israel, and because I will do this unto you, prepare to meet your God, Israel. For lo, he that forms the mountains and creates the wind and declareth unto man what is his thought, that makes the morning darkness and treads upon the high places of the earth, Jehovah, the God of hosts, is his name. So in verse 12, they will now come face to face with God. The judgment will be far more severe. The next major judgment will be the Assyrian destruction and the Assyrian captivity, which will bring an end to the king of Israel in the year 722, 721 BC. 3 times in the book of Amos, he either says or he sings a hymn as a conclusion. And here we have in verse 13, we have the first of 3 short hymns that Amos composed and included in his book. And he incorporates it here to show who God is and what he does and what he's capable of doing. And because of who God is, he can bring to pass all of the judgments he's pronounced through Amos. This brings us now to the third, hear ye judgment, in Amos chapter 5, verse 1 to 17. We have the cause in chapter 5, verse 1 to 15. Hear ye this word which I take up for a lamentation over you, O house of Israel. The virgin of Israel is fallen, she shall no more rise, she's cast down upon her land. There is none to raise her up, for thus says the Lord Jehovah, the city that went forth 1,000 shall have 100 left, and that which went forth 100 shall have 10 left to the house of Israel. So this time Amos begins his prophecy with a lament, first 3 verses, and he declares that this is a lamentation in verse 1. In verse 2, the point of it is that the virgin of Israel is fallen. Israel has never been subdued by foreigners. Fallen here in funeral songs means fallen violently by the sword. And that's going to be her status as a result of the Assyrian destruction. So the picture here is that when Assyria is through with Israel, only 1/10 of the nation will be left. And we see it in verse 3. The cities that once had 1,000 will only have 100. The cities that had 100 will only have 10. So 10% will be left behind. Okay. Then in verses 4 to 9, he condemns Israel for failure to seek God. And he starts out with a positive and a negative admonition in verses 4 to 5. For thus says Jehovah unto the house of Israel, seek ye me, and ye shall live. But seek not Bethel, nor enter into Gilgal, and pass not to Beersheba. For Gilgal shall surely go into captivity, and Bethel shall come to naught. So in verses 4 to 7, they're guilty of failing to seek God. And he begins in verse 4 by giving them a positive admonition. Seek after God, and you shall live. God does respond to repentance, as Amos has brought out before. So positively, in verse 4, they are to seek God. But negatively, in verse 5, they're not to seek after idols. They may seek the two key Israelite idolatry centers near them at Bethel and Gilgal, but Bethel will come to nothing, and Gilgal itself is also destined for captivity. Now, in the Hebrew text here, there's a play upon words with the name Gilgal. The three words each have the letters G and L in them. In Hebrew, it reads Gilgal, Galo, Yigale. And in an English rendering, that will bring out the play upon the words. It would go something like this: Gilgal shall taste the gall of the galut, and galut means exile. That's the play upon the words in the Hebrew text. Or Gilgal, or more simply, it means Gilgal shall go to the gallows. So not only does he warn them against seeking the idolatry centers in their own country in Bethel and Gilgal, but he also warns them not to bother going down into Judah, because Beersheba was in Judah, and that was a stronghold of idolatry. And we'll see that later on in Amos 8:14. He says, Bethel shall come to naught, as Bethel means house of God, had become earlier on Bethaven, house of vanity. That was back in chapter 4, verse 15, because it was a temple of the idol. So the prophet, with allusion to this, he says, Bethel shall become Aven, vanity, nothingness, comes to naught. No mention here is made of the fate of Beersheba, because Amos is only prophesying to the 10 tribes up north and the destiny of the places beyond their territory. That's not the object of his prediction here. In actual fact, when Israel was ruined, Beersheba actually escaped unharmed. Seek Jehovah, verse 6, seek Jehovah and you shall live, lest he break out like fire in the house of Joseph and devour it, and there be none to quench it in Bethel. You who turn justice to wormwood and cast down righteousness to the earth, seek him that makes the Pleiades and Orion, and turns the shadow of death into the morning, and makes the day dark with night, that calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out upon the face of the earth. Jehovah is his name, that brings sudden destruction upon the strong, so that destruction comes upon the fortress. So in verse 6, what we see again here is that they fail to seek God. In verse 7, Amos spells out the status of the people, which is unrighteous. The house of Joseph, Ephraim, that's the kingdom of Israel, of which Ephraim was the distinguishing tribe. It was the largest tribe. At this point in verses 8 to 9 is the second hymn, and this one emphasizes the one whom they should seek, the one who made the constellations of the heavens. The Pleiades and Orion are also mentioned, we see in Job 9:9 and Job 38:31. So what Amos is saying here is that God is the one who controls the heavens and the earth. Seek him. He is the one who controls day and night. He's the one who controls the sweet water and the salt water. He's the one that should be seeking, not some weak man-made idols. 10 to 13, he points out that they're also guilty of unrighteous judgments. They hate him that reproves in the gate, and they abhor him that speaks uprightly. For as much as you trample upon the poor and take exactions from him of wheat, You have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not dwell in them. You have planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink the wine thereof. For I know how manifold are your transgressions, and how mighty are your sins. You that afflict the just, that take a bribe, and that turn aside the needy in the gate from their right. Therefore, he that is prudent shall keep silence in such a time, for it is an evil time. So in verses 10 to 11, they made unrighteous judgments. In fact, in verse 10, what we see is that they actively hate the few judges who are righteous. They hate the one that reproves them at the city gate, where judges exercise their judgment in those days. In verse 11, again, they're guilty of extortion against the poor in order to make themselves rich. And in verse 12, they're guilty of accepting brides, to the point where it says in verse 13 that those who are righteous find it prudent to keep silent. They find it useless to speak up against their sins. And as he completes this section, Amos concludes that it is an evil time. Finally, in verses 14 to 15, they're guilty of rejecting the Mosaic law. Seek good and not evil, that you may live. And so Jehovah, the God of hosts, will be with you as you say. Hate the evil, love the good, and establish justice in the gate. It may be that Jehovah, the God of hosts, will be gracious unto the remnant of Joseph. So these are elements and points of the Mosaic law which they have rejected. But if they return to it, God might still spare a remnant of Joseph. If they fail, the remnant itself will suffer judgment. So these are the causes that now lead to the judgment of verses 16 to 17. Therefore, thus says Jehovah, the God of hosts, the Lord, wailing shall be in all the broad ways, and they shall say in all the streets, alas, alas. And they shall call the husbandman to mourning, and such as are skillful in lamentation to wailing. And in all vineyards shall be wailing, for I'll pass through the midst of you, says Jehovah. Notice the word therefore. Here the judgment involves two things. First of all, in verse 16, there is wailing for the dead, because there'll be so many. The dead will be in all the streets and highways, and all the professional mourners will be earning a lot of money in that day. The professional mourners are those who are skilled in lamentation and mourning. And the second thing we see in verse 17 is that in all vineyards, there'll be wailing. Well, usually you have songs of joy in the vineyards, but now there's going to be a total destruction of the crops. We see here that he will pass through thee. That means he'll be taking vengeance. Remember, back in Exodus 12, the angel of death passed over or passed by. But here, God is passing through. When this judgment comes, death among the population and crop failure will occur together. So the book of Amos, we see it has three main divisions. First one was chapter 1 and 2, where he announced judgments against the nations, and as he was working his way up to Israel. And second main division, where we are now, chapter 3 to 6, we have a series of 5 prophetic proclamations of the sins and the judgments of Israel. First 3 are these which we have the hear ye ones, and they're the 3 we've just covered. Fourth and fifth ones are woe judgments, because he begins with that word in chapter 5, verse 18, and chapter 6, verse 1. As before, we're going to see next time, before he starts it with the cause, he then gives us, he'll then give us the judgment itself, which is introduced with the word again, therefore. Okay. That is it for tonight.